Yellow. 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 It was all yellow. It was all yellow. What's up? Yellow. There we go. That's actually more yellow. Yellow. All right. Check it out. This is more the vibe. This is like the PM broadcast right here. This is it. This is everything I want it to be. There we go. So if I wrote, yeah. That's what I want. And that's what I need. Cool. But I think it's duplicated here. So let's turn that off. That's what we're reading. Okay. All right. We're back. And we back. We back. We back. All right. I'm not going to lie. My voice is feeling kind of sore. After, I think it was about 4 hours. 4 hours of recording. So, trying to take it easy on these. But also, I'm trying to bring the, bring the performance, you know? So, we're on chapter 3. All right, chapter 3. It was inequality and social dissatisfaction. Let me make sure. All right, we're up on Twitch. We're good to go. Let's hit it. Chapter 3. Inequality and social dissatisfaction. Chapter 3. Inequality and social dissatisfaction. Increased inequalities. Neoliberal policies by prioritizing the free market, deregulation, and the reduction of state intervention have had a significant impact on the distribution of income and wealth, both between and within countries. All right, let me take that back from the top. Chapter 3: Inequality in Social Dissatisfaction. Increased inequalities. Neoliberal policies, by prioritizing the free market, deregulation, and the reduction of state intervention, have had a significant impact on the distribution of income and wealth, both between and within countries. One of the central promises of neoliberalism was that economic liberalization would lead to widespread economic growth and increased prosperity for all. However, this promise has not uniformly materialized. Instead, neoliberal policies have often exacerbated pre-existing inequalities. Instead, neoliberal policies have often exacerbated pre-existing inequalities. Neoliberal policies have often exacerbated pre-existing inequalities, resulting in an even greater concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a global economic elite, while much of the population has seen little or no improvement in their economic conditions. At the international level, inequality between countries manifested itself in several ways. At the international level, inequality between countries manifested itself in several ways. Developed economies with their abundant resources, advanced infrastructure, and well-established financial markets have been able to better take advantage of the opportunities created by neoliberal globalization. These economies have benefited from the liberalization of trade and investment, using their comparative advantages to expand their global economic influence and consolidate their industrial and technological power. These economies have benefited from the liberalization of trade and investment, using their comparative advantages to expand their global economic influence and consolidate and consolidate their industrial and technological power. On the other hand, many developing economies have faced significant challenges in trying to compete on a level playing field. Many developing economies have faced significant challenges in trying to compete on a level playing field. On a level playing field. This indiscriminate opening of markets often encouraged or imposed by international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank has often resulted in economic crises for these countries, unable to compete with the multinationals that entered their markets. Many local industries were destroyed, leading to unemployment, loss of income, and the weakening of national economies. Furthermore, financial liberalization exposed these countries to volatile capital flows that can move in and out quickly, causing economic instability. This was particularly evident during financial crises such as the 1997 Asian crisis. The 1997 Asian crisis, where the rapid outflow of foreign capital precipitated economic collapses in several countries. As a result, while rich countries continued to accumulate wealth, many developing countries remained stagnant. Or even suffered economic setbacks, increasing global economic disparity. Within countries, inequalities have also deepened as a result of neoliberal policies. In developed economies, market deregulation and tax reductions, especially for the richest, contributed to a significant increase in income concentration. These policies were founded on the belief that reducing taxes on the wealthy and corporations would stimulate investment and, in turn, promote economic growth. However, in practice, Much of the economic gains from res- much of the economic gains resulting from growth Much of the economic gains resulting from growth were appropriated by those at the top of the social pyramid. At the top of the social pyramid, while working class and middle class real wages remained stagnant or even declined. The financialization of the economy promoted by neoliberal policies. The financialization of the economy promoted by neoliberal policies played a crucial role in widening inequalities. Financialization refers to the growing importance of the financial sector in relation to other sectors of the economy. And the increase in the power and influence of financial institutions. The deregulation of financial markets has allowed the expansion of complex and risky financial products, which have generated enormous profits for banks, investment funds, and other financial actors, but which have also increased the volatility and fragility of the global economy. While the financial sector prospered, profits from this sector significantly outpaced gains from other sectors of the economy, widening the gap between rich and poor. In addition to income inequalities, wealth inequalities have also intensified. A small number of individuals and families have accumulated vast financial resources and assets, including real estate, stocks, and other investments. This concentration of wealth not only allowed this economic elite to exercise disproportionate power over public policies in the market. This concentration of wealth not only allowed this economic elite to exercise disproportionate power over the public policies and the market, but also contributed to the perturbation of inequalities. But also contributed to the perpetuation of inequalities. Since wealth tends to generate more wealth through capital income, while those without access to these resources they remained excluded from these benefits. The concentration of wealth has had far-reaching effects. One of the most worrying effects was the reduction in social mobility. The ability of a person to improve their socioeconomic position relative to the previous generation. In societies with high levels of wealth inequality, social mobility tends to be lower, as those born into wealthy families have access to better educational, healthcare, and social network opportunities. While those born into poor families, face significant barriers to achieving economic success. I gotta wait. I'm getting a text. This creates a more static and stratified society, where social and economic standing is largely determined by birth, rather than merit or effort. Furthermore, increasing inequalities have had a negative impact on social cohesion. In many societies, neoliberal policies by weakening unions and other collective bargaining mechanisms have further reduced workers' bargaining power. This exacerbated the disparity between executive salaries. Often inflated by bonuses and stock options. In the salaries of rank and file workers. Who often faced pay cuts, loss of benefits, and poorer working conditions. The erosion of union power has hampered workers' ability to negotiate better working conditions and fair wages. The erosion of union power has hampered workers' ability to negotiate better working conditions and fair wages, contributing to increased inequalities within countries. These growing inequalities are not just economic issues, but also political and social ones. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a global economic elite has created a power imbalance that has weakened democratic institutions, as those with the most resources have a greater ability to influence public policy in their favor. This can lead to the implementation of policies that benefit the rich at the expense of the poor and middle class, perpetuating a cycle of inequality and exclusion. In short, neoliberal policies, by prioritizing the free market, deregulation, and the reduction of state intervention contributed to the increase in income and wealth inequalities, both between and within countries. Although these policies promoted economic growth in many cases, the benefits of this growth were disproportionately appropriated by a small elite, leaving the majority of the population without significant improvements in their economic conditions. Leaving the majority of the population without significant improvements in their economic conditions. The inequalities resulting from these policies represent one of the most pressing challenges facing contemporary societies, requiring a reassessment of neoliberal approaches in a search for solutions that promote more inclusive and equitable growth. Welfare state crisis. Neoliberal policies have had a profound and lasting impact on the welfare state, which was a central feature of Western democracies in the post-war period. The welfare state, conceived as a social pact that aimed to provide economic The welfare state, conceived as a social pact that aimed to provide economic security and protect citizens against life's hazards, such as unemployment, illness, and old age. Was progressively weakened as neoliberal policies became prevalent. The search for economic efficiency and the pressure to reduce the public deficit led to a reassessment and subsequent reduction of the state's role in the economy and the provision of social services. Neoliberal policies promoted the idea that public spending, especially that for social programs, was excessive and unsustainable in the long term. As a result, there was a wave of cuts in budgets allocated to these areas, with the justification that reducing public expenditure would allow governments to achieve greater fiscal stability, avoid the accumulation of debt, and theoretically create a more favorable environment for growth. Created a more favorable environment for economic growth. Programs that provided safety nets for the most vulnerable, such as public health, education, unemployment insurance, and pensions, were subject to budget restrictions, resulting in a weakening of institutions that traditionally guaranteed a minimum of economic security for the population. The neoliberal logic behind these cuts was that by reducing this was that by reducing the state's role by reduce by reducing the state's role in the economy and limiting its intervention in markets, resources could be allocated more efficiently. In markets, resources could be allocated more efficiently, and markets would be able to operate more efficiently. In markets would be able to operate more effectively. It was hoped that the economic growth resulting from these reforms would benefit everyone, eventually leading to an improvement in the living conditions of the entire population. However, reality showed that these benefits did not materialize for anyone, and neoliberal policies often resulted in increased economic insecurity for large portions of the population, especially for those who depended directly on the welfare state. One of the most striking aspects of this period was the privatization of public services, which were previously guaranteed by the state. Sectors such as health, education, transportation, and energy were transferred to the private sector under the premise that market competition would result. Under the premise that market competition would result in better quality services at lower costs. Privatization was seen as a way to reduce the financial burden on the state and to encourage efficiency through competition. However, this transfer of responsibilities from the public to the private sector has had mixed and, in many cases, negative consequences. For consumers, privatization often resulted in increased costs, especially in areas where competition was limited or non-existent. Instead of benefiting consumers with cheaper and better quality services, privatization has often led to increased tariffs and unequal access to services. Those who could afford privatized services enjoyed improvements, while those who could not afford the costs were left without access to essential services. Further exacerbating inequalities. This disparity was particularly evident in the health and education sectors, where privatization created a two-tier system, one for those who could afford high-quality services, and a lower one for those who depended on what was left on what was left of the public sector, or more affordable but lower quality private options. but lower quality private options. The reduction of the welfare state also had the reduction of the welfare state also had negative consequences for equal opportunities. Education and health. Education and health are fundamental pillars to promote social mobility, as they provide the necessary foundations for individuals to improve their socioeconomic position. With the contraction of public services, with the contraction of the with the contraction of public services and the growing dependence on the private sector to provide these essential services, social divisions have deepened. Quality education and adequate health care have become increasingly inaccessible to the poorest sections of the population in many countries. The lack of access to these services not only perpetuated inequality, but also made it difficult for future generations to overcome the economic and social barriers inherited from their parents. The crisis of the welfare state under neoliberal policies has also impacted social cohesion. The crisis of the welfare state under neoliberal policies has also impacted social cohesion. In societies where social safety nets have been weakened, trust in public institutions has declined, and the feeling of social solidarity has been eroded. The perception that the state was no longer fulfilling its roles of protecting the most vulnerable led to increased social discontent and political polarization. In many countries, this resulted in the strengthening of populist and nationalist movements, which channeled popular frustration over neoliberal policies and promised to restore social protection and national sovereignty. Furthermore, the decline in the power of unions, which have traditionally played a crucial role in defending workers' rights, and negotiating better working conditions, has contributed to the precariousness of work and the expansion of inequalities. Workers' ability to bargain collectively has been weakened, resulting in lower wages, worse working conditions, and greater economic insecurity. The disparity between executive salaries and ordinary workers' salaries has increased significantly, reflecting the growing concentration of wealth and power in the hands of an economic elite. Popular reactions and social movements. Faced with increasing inequalities and the weakening of the welfare state, several popular reactions and social movements emerged. Several popular reactions and social movements emerged that vigorously contested neoliberal policies and the social consequences they generated. These movements have varied in their composition, breadth. These movements have varied in their composition, breadth, and objective. Breadth, and objectives, but share a common discontent with the uneven effects of globalization and the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a global economic elite. Responses to these neoliberal policies were not limited. Responses to these neoliberal policies were not limited to a single country or region. Rather, they have emerged as a global force. Reflecting widespread dissatisfaction with unfulfilled promises of prosperity and social justice. One of the most striking examples of these reactions was the anti-globalization movement, which rose to prominence in the late 1990s and early 2000s. This movement was made up of a broad coalition of activist groups, unions, non-governmental organizations, and intellectuals. Who criticized how globalization, guided by neoliberal policies, disproportionately benefited multinational corporations and economic elites, while leaving aside the needs of the poorest and most vulnerable populations. Criticisms of the anti-globalization movement focused on the idea that neoliberal globalization was being imposed from the top down without regard for local conditions, and the voices of affected communities. Demonstrations during IMF, World Bank, and WTO meetings have become symbols of global resistance to neoliberalism. One of the most emblematic events was the protest during the WTO meeting in Seattle in 1999. This event, which became known as the Battle of Seattle, brought together tens of thousands of protesters from different parts of the world who came together to express their opposition to neoliberal policies. The meeting was marked by violent clashes between protesters and police, and resulted in the interruption of WTO negotiations. Images of the demonstrations in Seattle have become iconic, symbolizing growing global dissatisfaction with neoliberalism and marking a turning point in marking a turning point in the public debate about costs and benefits of globalization. In addition to the anti-globalization movement, more localized and specific protests emerged. In addition to the anti-globalization movement, more localized and specific protests emerged, reflecting popular resistance to neoliberal policies in different national and regional contexts. In Latin America, for example, water privatization has become a significant point of confrontation. In the early 2000s, the city of Cochabamba, pretty sure that's Cochabamba. In the early 2000s, the city of Cochabamba, Bolivia, was the scene of the water war. A popular uprising against the privatization of the municipal water system that resulted in exorbitant tariff increases and limited access for the poorest populations. The successful mobilization of Bolivian citizens, which forced the government to reverse privatization, became an emblematic example of how neoliberal policies can be challenged and reversed. In Europe, the sovereign debt crisis in the early 2010s triggered a wave of protests against economic austerity policies, which were widely perceived as unfair and punitive towards the most vulnerable populations. Countries such as Greece, Spain, and Portugal saw large demonstrations and general strikes. Against cuts to public services, tax increases, countries such as Greece, Spain, and Portugal saw large demonstrations and general strikes against cuts to public services, tax increases, and labor reforms that were being implemented as a condition for receiving financial aid from institutions such as the IMF and the European Union. The protests reflected popular frustration with the perception that austerity policies were being imposed to protect the interests of international creditors and financial elites, while the burden of the measures fell disproportionately on the workers and the poorest sectors of society. In the United States, the fight for living wages and labor rights has has gained momentum in response to increasing job insecurity and wage stagnation. Movements like the Fight for 15, which calls for raising the minimum wage to $15, which calls for raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, illustrate how workers have resisted neoliberal pressures to keep wages low and reduce social benefits. These movements also highlight the importance of unionization and collective organization as ways of resisting the erosion of labor rights and fighting for a fairer distribution of the fruits of economic growth. In recent years, movements such as Occupy Wall Street in the United States and the Gilets jaunes yellow vests and the Gilets jaunes yellow vests in France have further highlighted growing inequality and the concentration of economic power as central issues in public debate. The Occupy Wall Street movement, which emerged in 2011 in response to the global financial crisis and growing income inequality, adopted the slogan, "We are the 99%," in reference to the concentration of wealth in the hands of the richest 1% of the population. The movement criticized the financial system and the role of corporations in perpetuating inequalities, and brought to light discussions about the need to reform the economic system to make it fairer and more inclusive. Similarly, the Gilets jaunes in France began as a protest against rising fuel taxes. The Gilets jaunes in France began as a protest against rising fuel taxes, but quickly expanded to include a wide range of demands, from improving purchasing power to reforming the tax system and redistributing income. The movement was driven by the perception that political and economic elites were disconnected from the realities faced by the majority of the population. The movement was driven by the perception that political and economic elites were disconnected from the realities faced by the majority of the population, and that neoliberal policies were exacerbating social and economic inequalities. These social movements often aligned These social movements often allied themselves with political currents that sought to directly challenge neoliberal policies through alternative governance proposals. Left-wing parties and movements in various parts of the world, such as Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, and Bernie Sanders in the United States, have emerged as political voices that have proposed the revitalization of the welfare state, income redistribution, and implementation of more inclusive and fair economic policies. These proposals include strengthening public health and education systems, increasing taxes on the richest, protecting labor rights, and promoting sustainable environmental policies. Chapter 3 was supposed to be short. Chapter 3 was an hour. Chapter 4 is 23 pages. I think this was 10. $61 of 109. Okay, how far along are we? 61 of 109. All right, we're just over halfway. We're 55% of the way there. So we started at 45. Now we're at 55. So we got 10% of the way. Oops. My bad. I think this next chapter will definitely have to be my last. There we go. Yeah, only because it is such a long chapter. So I don't know if I could finish it, but But I think if I get like a good amount through this, it'll put me in a very good position to start tomorrow and finish tomorrow. So hopefully that's where we're at. Okay. Oop. Okay. Chapter 4: Resurgence of Nationalism. Nationalism in Context. Nationalism, as an ideology and political movement, has a rich and complex history dating back to the 18th and 19th centuries, where it began to emerge as a central force in the formation of modern nation-states. During this period, classical nationalism developed in response to the decline of multinational empires and the rise of sovereign nations. This type of nationalism was characterized by a strong identification with the nation, usually defined in terms of shared language, culture, and history. It promoted the idea of self-determination, arguing that each nation should have the right to govern itself free from foreign domination. This ideology was fundamental in the creation of many of the modern nation states, and played a crucial role in independent struggles and the consolidation of national borders. Classical nationalism was largely a project of identity construction. Where political and cultural elites sought to unify the population around a common national identity. This involved the promotion of a shared historical narrative, the standardization of language, and the centralization of power in a sovereign nation-state. These incentives were often supported by public education campaigns and the promotion of national symbols such as flags, anthems, and monuments, which helped solidify a sense of belonging and loyalty to the nation. However, contemporary nationalism, which resurfaced strongly at the end of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st century, presents different characteristics compared to its predecessor. While still maintaining an emphasis on national identity, current nationalism is often reactive, emerging as a response to the pressures of globalization, mass migration, and the perceived loss of national sovereignty. This new nationalism is distinguished by its defensive and, in many cases, exclusionary nature. While classical nationalism often focused on building a positive and inclusive national identity, contemporary nationalism tends to define itself in opposition to others perceived as threats to national cohesion and sovereignty. One of the most striking features of contemporary nationalism is its anti-globalization rhetoric. This type of nationalism sees globalization as a force that dilutes national identity, weakens state sovereignty, and places the interests of global elites above the interests of nations and their ordinary citizens. Advocates of contemporary nationalism often argue that globalization disproportionately benefits large multinational corporations. Advocates of contemporary nationalism often argue that globalization disproportionately benefits large multinational corporations and economic elites, while harming local industries, destabilizing the job market, and undermining cultural traditions. This feeling is intensified by the perception that globalization facilitates mass migration, which is seen as a threat to the cultural identity and economic security of the native population. Anti-immigration rhetoric is, in fact, a central component of contemporary nationalism. In many countries, increased migration flows exacerbated by conflicts, economic inequalities, and climate change have been used as a scapegoat for a series of social and economic problems. Contemporary nationalists often claim that immigrants are competing for jobs, overwhelming welfare systems, and threatening cultural cohesion. This rhetoric tends to simplify and polarize public debate, ignoring the complexities and positive contributions that migrants bring to economies and societies. Another distinctive aspect of contemporary nationalism is its populist character. Political leaders Political leaders who embrace this form of nationalism often use the idea of the people versus the elites or the foreigners as a strategy for building and maintaining power. Populism in this context presents a dichotomous view of society where the people are seen as homogeneous and virtuous, while elites and foreigners are portrayed as corrupt and threatening. While elites and foreigners are portrayed as corrupt and threatening. This simplified and emotionally charged narrative is effective in mobilizing segments of the population who feel excluded or threatened by the economic and social changes brought about by globalization. In many cases, these populist leaders promise to restore the nation's greatness and purity by reversing globalist procedures and protecting the interests of native citizens against perceived external threats. Furthermore, contemporary nationalism is notable for its ability to adapt to different cultural and historical contexts, which explains its widespread in various parts of the world. Unlike classical nationalism, which was often based on a homogeneous ethnic or cultural identity, contemporary nationalism can manifest itself in contexts where national identities are more fluid or contested. For example, in countries with a history of ethnic and cultural diversity, contemporary nationalism may focus on narratives of exclusion, seeking to define the nation in opposition to specific groups who are perceived as not belonging. This flexibility allows contemporary nationalism to be shaped to meet the specific needs and anxieties of different populations, making it a powerful tool for political mobilization. This adaptability also means that contemporary nationalism can align with a range of ideologies and political movements, from the populist right to left-wing movements, seeking to challenge global neoliberalism. In some contexts, contemporary nationalism emerges with social protectionism, defending policies that prioritize national production and consumption to the detriment of international trade. In others, it can adopt an authoritarian stance. With leaders using nationalism to justify strengthening state control and repressing dissent. Causes of resurgence. Causes of resurgence. The resurgence of nationalism in recent decades. The resurgence of nationalism in recent decades is a complex phenomenon that can be attributed to a combination of economic and political and cultural factors, all interconnected with the dynamics of neoliberal globalization. All interconnected with the dynamics of neoliberal globalization. This revival of nationalism did not occur in a vacuum. It emerged as a response to the profound socioeconomic transformations. It emerged as a response to profound socioeconomic transformations that have shaped global landscape in recent decades. One of the main factors that fostered the return of nationalism is widespread dissatisfaction with the effects of neoliberal globalization. Although globalization has been promoted as an engine of economic growth and global prosperity, the benefits of this process have not been distributed equitably. While some sectors and regions have experienced prosperity and growth, others have been left behind, resulting in increased economic inequalities. This disparity has created a sense of frustration and injustice, particularly among populations that have not benefited from the promises of globalization. Deindustrialization, especially in developed countries, was one of the most visible and painful results of neoliberal globalization, as manufacturing industries moved to countries with lower production costs. As manufacturing industries moved to countries with lower production costs. As many manufacturing industries moved to countries with lower production costs, many communities that depended on these jobs faced mass unemployment, economic stagnation, and a decline in living standards. The loss of jobs in traditional sectors, such as manufacturing, was not just an economic issue, but also a cultural issue, as many workers found their identities and ways of life threatened. This process fueled a feeling of economic insecurity. And abandonment on the part of governments, which were perceived as more concerned with serving the interests of global economic elites than with protecting the jobs and well-being of ordinary citizens. The 2008 financial crisis further exacerbated these tensions. The crisis exposed the weaknesses of the global economic system and deepened the legitimacy crisis of governments that followed neoliberal policies. Government responses to the crisis, which often included fiscal austerity policies, had a devastating impact on many countries, particularly in Europe. Cuts in essential public services, increased unemployment, and the reduction of social benefits generated mass protests and mobilizations against the established economic order. These austerity policies were seen as punitive, particularly for the most vulnerable populations, while banks and financial institutions, largely blamed for the crisis, were bailed out with public funds. In addition to economic issues, mass migration played a significant role in the resurgence of nationalism. The arrival of large numbers of migrants and refugees, often as a result of global conflicts, economic crises, and climate change, have been perceived by many as a threat to national identity. Security, and economic well-being. In countries already facing economic and social challenges, mass migration was seen as an additional burden, exacerbating existing tensions and fueling fears that limited resources would be fought over by growing numbers of people. Mass migration also triggered a feeling of loss of control over national borders and a perception that governments were failing to protect the integrity and cultural identity of the nation. This sentiment was exploited by nationalist movements which promised to restrict immigration and protect national cultural identity. Anti-immigration rhetoric became a powerful tool for mobilizing support, particularly among those who felt left behind by globalization, and who saw immigrants as competitors, and who saw migrants as competitors for jobs and resources. These factors have been amplified by growing distrust towards supranatural institutions such as the European Union, EU, Many citizens began to view these institutions as distant, bureaucratic, and indifferent to national concerns. The EU, in particular, was often criticized for imposing policies that were perceived to be contrary to national interests. such as mm, such as austerity po- such as austerity policies and migration quotas. This feeling of national interests were being sacrificed in the name of globalization and supranational integration. This feeling of national interests were being sacrificed in the name of globalization and supranational integration. This feeling that national interests were being sacrificed in the name of globalization and supranational integration created fertile ground for the resurgence of nationalism. The crisis of sovereignty, or the perception that nations were losing control over their own economic policies and borders, became a central theme of contemporary national movements. In response, many of these movements have advocated the rejection of neoliberal globalization and the restoration of national control over the economy, borders, and social policies. The idea of taking back control became a popular slogan among nationalists. Reflecting the desire to regain sovereignty that many felt had been usurped by global elites and supranational institutions. These dynamics have contributed to the strengthening of political leaders who use nationalism as a platform to challenge the status quo and promise a new era of prosperity and national security. These leaders often adopt populist rhetoric, presenting themselves as defenders of the people against globalist elites and foreigners. Who are to blame for the country's problems. In many cases, this populist nationalism has led to political polarization and a weakening of democratic norms. As nationalist leaders seek to consolidate power and weaken institutions that could limit their authority. Nationalist and populist movements. The resurgence of nationalism and populism in recent decades has manifested itself in distinct ways in various regions of the world, each with its own historical and cultural peculiarities, but all reflecting the broad dynamics of dissatisfaction with neoliberal globalization, perceived loss of sovereignty, and growing inequality. In the United States, the nationalist and populist movement gained strength notably with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Trump's campaign was marked by a strongly nationalist rhetoric, summarized in his slogan, "Make America Great Again." This motto evoked a vision of a glorious past that had been lost. He said, due to neoliberal and globalist policies. Due to neoliberal and globalist policies that sacrificed American interests in favor of elites and other nations. Trump has promised to reverse this situation through measures such as building a wall on the border with Mexico. Trump has promised to reverse this situation through measures such as building a wall on the border with Mexico to prevent illegal immigration, which he described as a threat to security and national identity. Which he described as a threat to security and national identity, as a threat to the security and national identity of the United States. Additionally, he rejected international trade agreements. Such as the Trans-Pacific Treaty, TPP, and the Paris Climate Agreement, arguing that these agreements harmed American workers and the country's economy. Trump's election was widely seen as a rejection of traditional political elites and neoliberal policies that his supporters said had failed to protect the interests of ordinary people. The success of his campaign highlighted the depth of popular discontent with the status quo and the desire for a more protectionist and nationalist approach. In Europe, nationalism has also manifested itself significantly, especially with Brexit. The 2016 referendum in which the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. The 2016 referendum in which the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union was largely driven by nationalist concerns. Was largely driven by nationalist concerns and anti-immigration sentiments. The campaign for Brexit was marked by rhetoric about the need to take back control of the country's borders and laws, resisting the supranational influence of Brussels. For many Brexit supporters, the European Union represented a threat to the UK's national sovereignty, imposing rules and regulations that, in their view, did not reflect British interests. Brexit, therefore, was an expression of the desire to re-establish national autonomy in a globalized world that seemed increasingly out of control. Similar movements of nationalism have resurfaced. Similar movements of nationalism have resurfaced in other European countries. Similar movements of nationalism have resurfaced in other European countries. In France, the Front National, now known as the Rassemblement now known as Rassemblement, 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 Rassemblement National, led by Marie Despins, Marine Le Pen, led by Marine Le Pen, capitalized on discontent with immigration, and globalization to promote a nationalist agenda. Le Pen, 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 like other Le Pen, like other European nationalist leaders, Le Pen, like other European nationalist leaders, adopted a critical stance towards the European Union, defending policies that prioritize national interests and limit immigration, which is seen as a threat to culture and national security. In Latin America, nationalism and populism also found fertile ground, although with characteristics different from those observed in the United States and Europe. Leaders such as Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Evo Morales in Bolivia promoted a type of nationalism that opposed not only neoliberal globalization, but also American imperialism. Chavez and Morales emphasized economic sovereignty and the redistribution of wealth as responses to the inequalities generated by global capitalism. Nationalism in Latin America. Nationalism in Latin America in this context is often intertwined with left-wing populism, differentiating itself from the right-wing populism observed in other regions. These leaders adopted anti-imperialist rhetoric, accusing the United States and other Western powers of exploiting the natural wealth and people of Latin America. Accusing the United States and other Western powers of exploiting the natural wealth and people of Latin America. Through policies of nationalization of strategic industries and wealth redistribution programs, Chavez and Morales sought to challenge the power of local and international economic elites, promoting a vision of sovereignty that was intrinsically linked to control of to control of national resources and social justice. These nationalist and populist movements, although varied in their forms and objectives, share a common rhetoric of defending national sovereignty against the forces of globalization and neoliberalism. They appeal to an electorate that feels helpless and threatened. They appeal to an electorate that feels helpless and threatened by the economic and social changes of recent decades. The central narrative of these movements is that political and economic elites have betrayed the people, handing over national sovereignty to supranational institutions, allowing neoliberal policies to destroy jobs, security, and cultural identity. In response to these movements, promise to restore control over national borders. The economy, and culture, often through protectionist, anti-immigration, and anti-globalization policies. In response, these movements promise to restore control over national borders, the economy, and culture, often through protectionist, anti-immigration, and anti-globalization policies. In short, the resurgence of nationalism and populism reflects a deep discontent with the effects of neoliberal globalization and a reaction against the perceived loss of control over national affairs. Although the contexts and manifestations of these movements vary from region to region, they all share a common rhetoric that aims to mobilize those who feel excluded or threatened by the economic and cultural transformations of the contemporary world. And cultural transformations of the contemporary world. I can't see any longer. I'm going to save that. All right. So as you can see right on page hold up. Okay. As you can see right on page 69, at the very end of this page, Chapter 5 begins. So, Chapter 4 was not as long as I thought it was, so I'm really glad I actually did it, because that brings me to page 69 of 109. Actually, this one is technically 70 out of 109. That brings us to 64%. So we are 64% of the way through. That's a huge fraction done today. What were the prices I paid for that? My voice does sound very, very feels very used at the moment. I feel like I've been talking all day. I really do feel like I've been talking all day. So that is a thing. I'm going to be feeling. Hold up. it go on the other side? No. There we go. So I think tomorrow we're going to easily hit the rest of this, because if I could literally go from 0 to 64%, the rest of it should just come fairly easy. And a couple different things, I'll get started earlier and go for later on the first round, and then I'll just have editing to do on it. I'll just have editing to do. So very excited that I have all that. Very excited that I, did the majority of the work here today. That's fantastic. But of course, once we produce the recording, then we have to edit it down. And I've made it in such a way that I've been flowing through it pretty easy. So I'm happy that it seems like I may have done, for the most part, just one take, except for some of the stuff that I've just been doing. Fortunately, I have a lot of good stuff that's good the first take through. So hopefully that'll make editing way quicker. And that's it for us today. That's it for us today, because we're at 8:30 right now, and we hit chapter 5. So we have 5, 6, and then conclusion, I think, is all we have. So we have 3 more chapters to do tomorrow, and then we're perfect. We're fine. We're all good. And then we have editing to do, and we'll just do editing until the end of the night tomorrow. And hopefully I can start putting in chapters, and that'll give them a good indication that I'm making some movement on the project. So thank you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I super appreciate you. I've seen a lot of people come in and out throughout as I was doing this. I was keeping my eye on the prism here, so I was just making sure that if anybody popped in and said anything, I could go ahead and read it right away. But we're going to be back in the closet tomorrow, and we are going to knock out the rest of this book. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. I'll hit you guys up with the promo code at the end for this audiobook that I make. And it should be live on Audible, assuming that I do a good amount of the editing tomorrow and edit throughout the week. It should be released either by the end of this next week or the week after. So I'll let you guys know when it's released, but this is my main focus for the holiday. And then we're moving on to the second project, Medical Law and Technologies, and Technological Advances. And then we're moving on to all of the projects for the nuclear energy series. So that will be on the docket as well. Hope you guys enjoyed so far. Thank you for keeping me company while I'm in this audio recording booth right now, and